Thank you. So that was 4 great perspectives and reactions. So we have time for questions, about 20 minutes, and certainly for these 4 panelists, but also the other individuals that spoke today too. So we have Steve, Wendy's still here, Kim's still here, and we can also, ask questions to our first 2 folks too. So any questions out there? Okay, good. Oh, Steve's got a question. You want to?
I was struck by the landscape and Noah, your point about learning from all the other trials that are going on. I know of about 6 or 7. There are a lot I didn't know about. Is there any mechanism, organization, or some way of aggregating the experience of those for things like recruitment success or new ways of assessing endpoint experience with shipping drugs? There are several things I would really like to know across the organizations, people, and academics that are doing this. Is there any place where that's being done? And if not, could we figure out a way to pull all of that together so that we can learn? It's just right now, it's just so many one-offs that I'd love to talk to all the people who are on that list.
One thing I was just thinking of is kind of, this is again a reaction, but one of the purposes that we have for the NIH Collaboratory is this kind of as knowledge repository. And so we actually started, putting together kind of chapters around this. And so that's certainly a home that we could have for this, because I agree with you, Steve. Like, we want to actually make this less proof of concept or examples, but what are the kind of how-tos or approaches that can be more universal? The other thing, I think we also have to be honest with what are still the challenges here, because I think we all, and I'll say I'm in this, drink the Kool-Aid and so forth, and then I get shocked when we have 97% of an outcome and someone says that's not good enough because they expect 100%. So,
and then one last thing that was prompted by we passed at Genentech, I guess, like ships in the night. Their innovation program closed after 3 years. And I know of another one that's also closed after about 3 or 4 years. And one of the problems has been, the typical innovations thing where you develop a whole basket of shiny new things and cool toys and ways of measuring that are not necessarily, as Josh was saying, fit for the protocol. You can grab from the toolbox things that you need to make it work better, but just because you've got the technology doesn't mean you have to shop it to other trials. And I learned there one really adverse effect of new technologies that can collect so much data, wearables, and that is, you got all that's really cheap to collect, but it's expensive to analyze and manage and deal with all of the consequences of unexpected findings. And so I think that the enthusiasm about virtualizing measurements in people needs to be tempered by the fact that it's not cost-free, and it's, particularly, anyway, again, it should be fit to simpler protocols.
Yeah, I can just give a brief response. What you were touching on, it was one of the lessons, as I've always had a kind of courageous exploratory nature to my career, but doing the first phase 3 IV versus oral drug trial with Genentech, you couldn't have picked a harder trial. And one of the things that the innovation group did teach me is you are going to face a challenge, and we are going to get past that. And if they hadn't been there in those early days to show you how you get past that, call the CEO if you need to, I would have quit many times, because I didn't. This wasn't my whole thing. I wanted to touch on the point about costs. Craig brought it up a bit. It comes up a lot in this, and this idea that you should be doing better, faster, and cheaper all at once, it's a bit absurd to think that you're going to get all 3 of those in one swing. I'm a novice to this space, to be honest. I'm really a scientist, but my general feeling is that the country or the world in general will recognize extreme cost savings by speeding up discovery. Lives will be saved, most importantly. Patient burden will be reduced. But that's going to come over the arc of decades. What we're doing is better and potentially faster. And for that, the cost is shifting from the patient burden to the sponsor or to the owner of the IP. And that's how it has to be. It costs the patients a lot to give up a day of their life and go to the hospital. They drive there, they take a day off from work, or their kids do. To send a nurse to the patient's house, it is more expensive. It's a fact. But that is much better for the patient, and it shortens the trials. So if you think that this is all going to be cheaper today, you really have to check your rationale around how that's going to be happening. And I think that the arc of time will give us back all the savings as a society. And even to the individual companies, it'll come back in the arc of years.
Thank you. Türkan Gardenier, longtime statistician. As much as I'm inspired with what you're doing, I'm also inspired by the parallel efforts on precision medicine, which is really patient-centered medicine. Over the past 3-4 years, my husband and I have attended a number of National Academies symposia and workshop briefings on precision medicine. In fact, statisticians, including myself, are working on technology for not only looking at means and standard deviations and t-tests, but profiles generated for individuals over time and for subgroups of patients. And I think this wonderful effort of creating databases with new technology, which is cheaper, with precision medicine has a number of very promising applications over the next few years. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll respond to that. No question that precision medicine has tremendous process, and I don't think that this group is necessarily, not that you were implying it, that virtual trials is better than any other innovation. Absolutely no doubt. But one of the things that is important about it is that it's broad. So if you think about participants in clinical research, and we talked about it earlier today, by and large, they look a lot like the participants in this room. They tend to be more light than dark. They tend to be more affluent than not. They tend to be more educated than not and more urban than not. So I think that's the truth, right? That's why patient diversity is so important, and that's actually possibly why, less than 5% participate. So I think, not to compare and contrast, because I think innovations, there's so many great innovations. The power of this is that it's really allowing us to bring studies to the masses who need it. That 40 million of underinsured that we talked about earlier. So not comparing, I'm just saying that's why this stuff is important.
As somebody with innovation on my big pharma business card, the metric of success for my group isn't how many pilots we run, but what we can scale into the organization. And hearing the discussion with this panel and the one prior, it kind of feels like this isn't going to scale until we have simplified protocols and better endpoints. Is that the case? And how long are we going to have to wait for this to become more mainstream if those are the required precursors for this to be mainstream?
I'm just going to say definitely. And the example that that we live in, say in cardiovascular care and cardiovascular outcomes, people routinely say cardiovascular death has got to be part of the primary outcome. And there's this kind of notion that we have this clairvoyant state that we can always understand what the cause of death. When you actually ask patients or potential participants, do they care which way they die? A lot of times they don't necessarily care, except that it's peaceful. But the idea in terms of simplification about the outcomes and ensuring that we can capture the outcomes on a routine basis is really important. The second thing in terms of simplification is whenever we're designing or developing new studies and you hear the concept of wouldn't it be nice to have, that's just completely opposite of what we're aiming for. or a group, and I have friends in pharmacovigilance, for instance, where they're having to manage risk, and so they're worried about what is the unknown unknowns, and so how can they take care of it through this, and so you get a lot of ornaments on the tree.
Yeah, I'll respond to Craig. I think that, I'm humbled by how far we've come in 4 years as a company, and because 4 years ago there was your trial remote, there was a handful of trials known that were done this way at all, and now, as Josh was pointing out, a lot of what we're doing we can't talk about because it's still a little proprietary with most of our clients, but the tipping point to me, as again new to this space, is it's here, and it's really shifting from, each of the projects we do is 2 to 3 years or 2 to 4 years long. So what we started 3 years ago is now the learnings are here, and what we're starting now are most of our strategic partners, and all of the large organizations are quite different, but the people that are in the boat with us to learn collaboratively are shifting very quickly to design for fit. And you can choose trials very quickly. This isn't ready for every trial in the world, let's be honest. But you can choose trials where there is no difference in endpoint. Like A1C is a great example. It's like if the endpoint is a blood test, whether that's done at home or at Quest or in the clinic, it doesn't matter. It's sent to the same lab. The end result is the same. The simplification and the design for fit, design for participant or patient, that is the critical thing. But it feels like within the momentum is happening, it's ready for scale. Our company, it's not in here, but one of the trials we did and publicized was a complete 372 patient, no randomized control trial at home, no sites whatsoever, completely virtual. And that is doable with just one little company like us. If IQVIA is going for it, the tipping point is here, it feels like to me. And within our knowledge base, the choices that are being made to launch new things today are beyond the pilot stage, I think.
Other questions or comments? We saw a little bit on slides around e-identity. So I don't know who might want to stab at that, but we certainly saw some examples. We had on Steve's slides a little bit around informed consent and having to, prove an ID in some way, shape, or form, and even direct to patient where there needed to be, an identification of a patient that was receiving the medication. So any thoughts on that?
I have some strong thoughts about some of those notions. I'll just give 2 quick notes on it, though. One is in the trials most of the trials that we're talking about, which are interventional trials, in our case, the doctor-patient relationship is the same or more enhanced than it is when you're sitting next to a person. So knowing who the patient is in those visits and then how they're connected to their device is as intense as a normal visit or as a banking exchange. That's from our experience. It's much harder to commit fraud and not be that person in our type of trial than it is in a regular trial. The second is where I have more strong, and don't take this as political, but it's somewhat political, is we do not ask patients for photo IDs in the normal clinical trial. When you sit down with a patient, your front desk may ask them for a photo ID to prevent insurance fraud, but as a doctor-patient, you do not ask people for an ID. And to set the bar higher for remote trials or direct participant trials is wrong, but it's wrong for not that reason. It's wrong because disenfranchised and underserved people, just like voting, don't have photo IDs and can't get them very easily. And so to discriminate against people, again, like we have with voting for clinical trials, is downright wrong. I have got advice, although verbal, from both the former administration, White House, the FDA, and Francis Collins directly, that they all agree that having photo IDs as the form of how we say who a patient is downright wrong. So I'm just saying it's not going to be written in this report, but I think it's to set that bar high is wrong for a couple of reasons on e-identity.
So I agree with many of the points there. I think there are a couple challenges that are out there. One is that state law does vary, and so we've actually encountered that in terms of some of the requirements that we had to deal with for authentication and of people participating in these studies. The second thing that we didn't realize in some other studies is that people share iPhones, they share smartphones, they share technology, they share passwords, they share a lot of things. And so, and it actually varies sometimes, across the country where that happens. And so there have been studies where we're doing embedded within trials for which that's when we discovered that they were actually sharing their smartphone. And so these are families that perhaps they have one smartphone that they use, they have other kind of technology or simple phones that they're using for else. And so there is, some context here where it's important to understand, who's actually participating. There are a lot of ways to get around that don't have to go through the kind of laborious requests that Steve highlighted, or some of the other ideas that are beyond what we do for routine healthcare.
Maybe just add a quick comment because it looks like we're almost done here. Is there a red light somewhere? I'm colorblind. I don't see. You're the red light. So all I want to say is this. I completely agree with Noah's comments about the fact that we shouldn't hold virtual trials to a higher bar than we do, randomized controlled clinical trials that, we've been doing for 70 years. But I will say that there's certain areas where you do need to pay attention. For example, when you're direct-to-patient medication, you want to make sure it's not going to the neighbor, right? So over there, that's where you do want to take it into account, but it doesn't necessarily need to be complicated, right? So there are ways to use telemedicine to be able to say, hey, patient, are you the one that's receiving? And you know them. To Noah's point, is that in a televisit, you see them every week, you can interact with them. So there's very simple ways that you can get to compliance, including things like medication. Bipolar study, is the patient taking the drug or not? In a regular study, when they go home with a blister pack, you have no idea, right? But and a virtual trial, you can get on a daily basis. Hey, let's just jump on a televisit for 5 minutes, take the medication, everything good. You're assuming they're not holding it under their tongue, and so you can actually get much higher level of compliance using simple things.
Great. Well, I want to thank the panelists for a great session this afternoon, and all the other speakers for the session.